Welcome everyone. My name's Lisette Callaveld and I work at the Centre for Social Impact, and I am here to welcome you to the Centre for Social Impact public seminar series for this month. I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the Whadjuk Noongar people's land. They are the traditional owners of the land that we are on today at the University of Western Australia. We recognise that the Whadjuk Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land, and we know they continue to practice their values, their languages, beliefs and knowledge, and we pay deep respects to the elders past and present. So feel free, if you were from a different place, to put the lands that you're from in the chat. So today we have a pretty a topic that has gained a lot of interest. There are registrations from across the country and even internationally. And we are very lucky to have Associate Professor David Webb present to us. So originally, David received his PhD from Wales, I believe, but he's been at the University of Western Australia since 1997. And he introduced actually UWA to the first courses in sustainable business ahead of his time. He's also helped to support UWA and the UWA Business School's commitment to sustainability. So in 2013, he initiated the Business School's membership of the UN Principles for Responsible Management Education. And in 2016, he initiated UWA's partnership of the United Nations Global Compact. So I think it's just grown and grown, this interest in the relationship between business, the environment, and individual well-being. And much of Dave's current work sits under the broader umbrella of regenerative, business, and planetary health. So they're big, big topics, and we are so lucky today that Dave can walk us through the topic within the hour with a brief overview. So feel free to think about what you'd like to ask Dave at the end of his presentation, because he has set aside some time for discussion or specific questions. So I will be calling on you for that. If there's anything that you desperately need clarified or rectified in between, feel free to put your comments in the chat. And other than that, I will hand over to Dave.
Thank you, Lisette. So let me just shift the screen here, and hopefully that should be opening, although it's a bit slow. Have you got that full view in front of you, Lisette?
Yep, looks good.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome, and welcome to everybody participating. Now having the full screen open in front of me, I can't see anybody. Unfortunately, it's not like a classroom environment. So what I notice is that I tend to emulate what I do in a classroom, which is move around a lot. So that's the reason why I don't have sort of like a focus screen behind me. Otherwise, I would keep disappearing behind this veil. So, but anyway, let me get straight into the presentation. Lisette was saying that, you know, I've been involved in this sort of work around sustainability for a long time now, and as not surprisingly, of course, my thinking has also changed over time and developed. And a number of years ago, I came across some ideas which were in a different context. I was studying permaculture at the time, and started thinking about regenerative agriculture and what that means. And then my interest in the concept of regenerativity and how it might apply in a broader sphere really sort of took over. And now very much every part of what I'm doing orients around what it means to live a regenerative life, what a regenerative future could look like. And that in essence is where I'm going to be moving to. I was saying to to Paul and Lisette earlier that I actually officially retire from the university in December, January. And what that means is I'll take on an honorary position, the goal being to really focus on this work exclusively and dedicate my efforts over the next years to looking at what I describe as shifting the conversation in business and elsewhere from sustainability to regenerativity. And so this presentation is part of the agenda that I've set myself moving forward. So yeah, this chap's not going to be retiring and playing golf or whatever. I will keep active in this space. So so starting with the presentation, so I intentionally kind of focus some of the presentation on, I guess, some of the negative consequences of human activity, and I think that's really important to take a realistic look at where we're at as a society and where the planet is at, to be able to map out a trajectory moving forward. So I've tempered that down in the presentation, in the presentation title, but I'll pick it up again as we go through. So if we look at what sustainability actually means, and as it is understood within organizations and within businesses, a lot of that comes out of the 1987 Brundtland Commission report, where they talk about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I guess the question there is, how are we doing in that respect? And the answer, of course, as I'm sure you'd come up with yourselves, is we're not doing too well on this one, because at the rate that we're depleting resources, we're compromising the ability of future generations not only to meet their own needs, but moreover impacting negatively on their health and well-being, and also that of the planet. Not sure whether anybody's familiar with the concept of overshoot day. Overshoot day depicts a day in the year when we arrive at that tipping point that sort of denotes, I suppose, the point at which we've actually already consumed all the available natural resources, and going beyond that, we're sort of then dipping into negative territory. And the Earth Overshoot Day for this year was the 1st of August. So what that means is everything in terms of the consumption of natural resources beyond the 1st of August is we're looking at borrowed resources. And of course, we don't have those resources. All the resources we're talking about are finite. So that's the day that we will have used up all of those available at Earth natural resources. Australia Overshoot Day is the 5th of April, as early as the 5th of April. So not 3 months into the year do we already hit that point at which we start tipping into borrowing resources, of course, that we don't have. So the remainder of the year, we're already exceeding consumption. I hear various things said that, we're living in an era where we're consuming 1.5 planets. That's the same adage that's been used for the last 10, 15 years. I think it exceeds that quite considerably. And so that's a considerable of concern. So what that means is that we're literally living in degenerate times. And what we need to do is to start to move towards and ask, well, what would the opposite be? And that obviously is about regeneration rather than degeneration. For businesses, sustainability refers to company strategy or actions to reduce adverse environmental social impacts. This is one that I've picked up in particular from IBN. It reflects the statements of many organizations. So I'm not picking on IBM for any particular reason other than when I did a quick search, they happened to pop up, and I know everybody knows IBM. But the emphasis here, though, is in what I've colored out in green: strategies to reduce adverse environmental and social impacts. That's reducing impacts. That's a key point. So how this is reflected in organizational strategies. Again, I've picked coals not for any particular reason other than, they present their strategy in the context of the SDGs, which is really progressive for organizations. But take a look at the bits highlighted in yellow: minimizing food waste, reducing unnecessary packaging, reducing waste to landfill, understanding the impacts of operations and supply chains, and minimizing negative impacts. So there's something about the language and something about the narrative there that runs through in terms of conversation around sustainability, right across the board, and even in society, not just within businesses. And that is that our understanding is that sustainability is about curbing the harm caused by business activities in a business sense, and reference to reducing, to minimizing, just highlights that. If we come forward, or not come forward, but step into the present a little bit, some other work by well-respected earth scientists, Johan Rockström and team. Johan Rockström originally back in 2009 and still today works from time to time at the Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm. A lot of the research that we see coming out in regard to earth science that feeds into IPCC reports, etc., comes out of that center, and by researchers working in collaboration with the center. So some viewers may be familiar with the concept of the planetary boundaries. Those you can see in the image on the right-hand side. These are the ecological boundaries that denote a safe and operating space for humanity to sustain life on Earth. They're kind of like the thermometer, if you like. They represent the health check of the planet. And beyond those boundaries lie unacceptable environmental degradation and potential tipping points into Earth systems. These tipping points, once we exceed a certain stage, then there's no return, essentially, from that point. A paper published recently in Science by Richardson and colleagues, including Johan Rockström, reveals that we've now exceeded 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. Back in 2009, in that original paper, 3 of the 9 had been exceeded, but now it's 6 as of 2023. In a conversation I had recently with a number of earth scientists, of which I'm not an earth scientist, suggest that we might have exceeded the 7th of those 9 boundaries in terms of ocean acidification, which is a significant issue in terms of managing carbon emissions. Also in 2023, Rockström, in a paper published in Nature, one of the most eminent journals, highlight that 7 of 8 Earth system boundaries, that's depicted on the right-hand side, for maintaining the resilience and stability of the Earth system and minimizing exposure to significant harm to humans from Earth systems change, a necessary but sufficient condition for justice. And we talk in regenerative terms about planetary health, as well as we do justice, and justice from a social perspective too. Ripple and colleagues somewhat more dramatically suggest that life on planet Earth is under siege and we're now in uncharted territory. Bear in mind, we're talking about research there in 2023 coming out of the Resilience Center based on IPCC data, which uses a somewhat historical data collection methodology to determine Earth temperatures. If we come forward a little bit further, a paper published in Nature Climate Change by 2 of our colleagues, Malcolm McCulloch and Julie Trotter, reveal, and this is using some of the most up-to-date methodologies using marine DNA testing, looking at 300 years of data preserved in sclerosponge carbonate skeletons. This is kind of the way in which they do this, as I understand, is somewhat similar to we might date a tree by looking at concentric circles around a tree. Here they're doing it accurately using DNA type data as well with sponges. So the accuracy of that data, they indicate that we already exceeded the critical 1.5 mark noted in the Paris Agreement, above pre-industrial levels. In fact, the authors highlight that we reached 1.7 plus or minus 0.1 in 2020. That is significant. And I think the point to highlight here is that in the conversations we hear in political agendas, etc., we still hear the suggestion that we have to do everything that we can to make sure that we don't exceed that 1.5 mark. Well, it's relevant, of course, because we may already have missed it by several years. And as Malcolm and colleagues indicate, anything approaching or going beyond 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels is considered catastrophic. And we know what we're thinking about here in terms of those catastrophes. The images that we see on the screen here, we're unfortunately all too familiar with. In fact, they even become normalized. I've heard of people they see this on the news and they're just kind of like, okay, well, that's business as usual, and walk away from it. Well, clearly the human social impacts are significant, with loss of life, human displacement, loss of homes, belongings, livelihoods, people's savings, and not to mention, of course, significant detrimental impacts to human health. So with that in mind, I have a question. It's a bit of a provocative question, but it really focuses on the point. If you had a loved one who is sick, would you be satisfied with simply minimizing and reducing how sick they are? Or would you want to see them recover and be restored to full health, and then have them be able to maintain positive health themselves without the need for further medical intervention or intervention of any kind? No, of course. I think all of us would agree that we would do everything that we could to achieve that for a loved one. And on the subject of loved ones, the planet upon which we're so dependent for every single breath that we take, we ask the question, is our planet sick? And when we look at those images and when we hear the reports coming out and we hear the concern raised across the globe almost on a daily basis, I think we'd have to agree, yes, our planet is somewhat sick. So the question that I would raise there is, so why then is our response any different in respect to the health of the Earth upon which we're dependent than it is for our loved ones? Why do we use the language and follow a narrative and develop associated strategies that aim at reducing and minimizing the sickness of the Earth when we wouldn't do that for loved ones? It simply just doesn't make sense. Our economy, which is bent on constant growth through the continual consumption of more and more finite resources, is problematic. And remember, Australia Overshoot Day occurred on April the 5th this year. And so, when we think of it in those terms, as a social scientist, we say, well, simply, this is not rocket science. There is nothing complex about the implications of what we all experience, not just what's on the screen in front of me, but what we all experience on a daily basis. And so we cannot consume our way out of the problem. And yet we're living in an environment, we're supported by an environment, by an economy that's driven by growth achieved through consumption. Yet consumption got us into this mess in the first place. And so we need a different model. Rather than a degenerative model, we need a model that is regenerative. Paul Hawken, who has been writing in this area now for decades, comments that the economic structures that created to support human well-being degenerate life on Earth, creating loss, suffering, and a heating planet. The financial system is abetting and investing in planetary liquidation, a short-term source of monetary wealth, and a near-term cause of biological depletion, poverty, and inequality. It then goes on to say, our economic systems, investments, and policies can bring about degeneration of the world or its regeneration. And so we're either stealing the future or we're going to heal the future. And I think the desired direction is pretty obvious in that case. So in a previous presentation that I gave and subsequent thinking, I write that no longer is it enough to talk about sustainability, where being sustainable means minimizing negative impacts on the environment. Simply put, we can't afford any negative impacts. Negative impacts lead to the same outcome, a potential environmental and human catastrophe. The only thing that changes with a slowing down effect of minimization strategies is the time frame of the negative outcome, the catastrophe. So seriously, we urgently need to be talking about what it means to be a regenerative business or living in a regenerative society or constructing a regenerative society, a business or society that emphasizes maximizing the positive impacts of its activities, systems, and processes. We need to work toward a regenerative future where the goal is a flourishing society and a flourishing planet for all. So regeneration is not only about bringing the world back to life, it's also about bringing each of us as individuals back to life. It restores forests, lands, farms, and oceans. The concepts of regenerativity are extended to all of these areas. We hear of the birth of regenerative cities. Melbourne in Australia has been becoming a regenerative city for the last 5 years, an amazing project. It's called Regen Melbourne for anybody interested. Maybe some of the listeners are actually in Melbourne at the moment. It builds green, affordable housing, reverses soil erosion, rejuvenates degraded lands, empowers rural communities, and all the positive benefits that come out of these, whether reversing soil erosion creates nutrient minerals within the soil where we can look at healthier foods, so that the consequences of what we talk about in food security, we no longer have food shortages. We have distribution problems, but at the same time, we have a system that seems to thrive on producing unhealthy foods, processed type foods, etc. So planetary regeneration creates livelihoods and occupations, bring people, life to people, and people to life. So these are the words of Paul Hawken in the introduction to his 2021 book, and I just embellish on a couple of those themes there to highlight that when we're talking about, or trying to develop an understanding, as I am as well, in terms of what does a regenerative future actually look like? What are we talking about in terms of regenerative systems? I recently enrolled in currently studying regenerative economics with a Capital Institute in the US, unfortunately late at night. We talk about regenerative accounting and finance, regenerative human resource management in businesses, regenerative logistics. We have regenerative medicine, regenerative design, regenerative land management, regenerative agriculture, regenerative cities, and so on and so forth. So here we're applying a concept, a set of ideas, and trying to, dig deep into those ideas and develop an understanding and an action agenda for moving forward into a much more regenerative situation. Conversation with people, I'm sure no different for listeners here today. So many people around the world are feeling lost and anxious and even fear at the state of the world. Just driving out of a friend's place the other day, there was somebody doing some revegetation work on their drive, and I stopped and talked to them, and they highlighted exactly the same. That they were once, it was kind of interesting that I should stop them, but they were an environmental scientist in a former life, and talking about the conversations they had with friends, exactly the same position. People worried about the future. Maybe the future, a regenerative future, seems too far away, too far-fetched, and impossible, unreachable. They give this a name as well in academia. It's called eco-anxiety, and there's a whole industry building up around psychologists who are working in this particular space. But we need to take those same energies and reframe them and apply them toward co-creating a regenerative future for all and for the planet. In an organizational sense, and this is an image that my colleague Susan Prescott, who's the UWA Professor of Planetary Health, she lives in the US, works for the School of Medicine, immunologist, essentially. We can use the same model here to develop an understanding of the impacts of not just climate change, but the whole gamut of Earth system boundaries on human health, which is depicted in the center of this image. And because we are academics, if we look at the dark blue there, we can see all of these human-made systems that have an impact, detrimental or potential positively so, not only on those planetary boundaries around the extremes, around the external side there, but also on health in the middle. So I recognize this because, focusing my attention on what it means to be a regenerative business, I very quickly came to realize that even in conversations with businesses are hemmed in with the best will in the world. They may, have an agenda, a purpose, to be a regenerative business. But when we operate in an economy that's non-regenerative, that's degenerative, very difficult for organizations, for businesses to work in that regenerative sense. So, it's not just about building regenerative businesses, it's about tapping into all of those systems, because all of these systems are interrelated. Part of what we talk about in planetary health recognizes that all of these systems in an ecosystem, in an ecological manner, are interrelated, interconnected, and the impact of one has a bearing on all of the others. And so that's that consistency with planetary health. By the way, planetary health is not just about the health of the environment, but looks at the health of the environment and its relationship with all of the systems on human health. And that's there's a lot of work in that area, and both Susan and I are doing what we can in that space. So the goal, as I've indicated, is looking towards what it means to develop a situation where we can truly talk about the planet in flourishing terms. So that, of course, is a very different language to the language that we would be able to use at the moment. We can't talk about the health in flourishing terms, albeit that we would like to, because that's not what we're experiencing. That's not what we're witnessing. And in fact, we're witnessing quite the opposite. Remember those Earth system boundaries. There are 9 Earth system boundaries upon which the planet is dependent, and already we have potentially overshot 7 of those, and certainly 6 according to the research. So big questions here. What does it take to create a flourishing society, a flourishing planet, and where the two interflourish, if you like? If we look at the way in which the language of regenerativity is used within organizations, you can see a very quick sort of snapshot here. We talk about regenerative leadership and what it means to be a regenerative leader, to create an organizational structure, a culture, a purpose which itself gives life to the organization. It's self-healing. That's what regenerative systems are. If we think about our own bodies, our bodies are naturally regenerative. Of course, when we're sick, they need to be restored, but once restored, they regenerate from themselves. Human cells, they regenerate themselves. We shed skin, grow skin, not in the same way as snakes, of course, but that is all a process of regeneration. Norris in 2015, and coming out of the Harvard Business School, talked about regenerativity in terms of net positive impact, where the handprint is bigger than the ecological footprint, a concept term that we're familiar with. John Fullerton, who runs the Capital Institute, with whom I'm studying regenerative economics at the moment, talks about multi-capital accounting methodologies and what that means for a different kind of an economy that's probably predicated around what it means to emphasize well-being. There are certain countries, New Zealand included, that emphasize the well-being rather than they do measuring progress in terms of GDP. Malaysia also, Iceland, Finland, Italy, and I'm sure other countries too are really trying to shift their focus away from a growth emphasis on GDP through consumption of finite resources, again, to asking that question of, what does it mean if we think in terms of growth in human flourishing terms? There's a lot around design and how design is applied, what we can understand from biomimicry, the concept of a circular economy, which certainly goes a long way towards regenerativity, but is not quite there as yet. And Morcelletto talks in terms of that self-renewable capacity, that regenerative, the self-healing capacity. We can use the same concept too in thinking about organizations as collections of individuals. An organization that creates, if you like, a self-determined environment where individuals feel autonomous and they have the competence, they feel connected with other individuals within the organization, are much more likely to operate in a self-determined manner. And that's taking us towards a situation where the ability or the potential of individuals to perform at their best is what we would describe as regenerative in those terms. So what about in industry? I look at the big firms such as KPMG. They use the language of regenerativity. They're already going beyond sustainability narrative. Regenerative by design, also talking about regenerative family businesses and what they look like and what that implies. Price Waterhouse have a global center for nature positive business. Ernst & Young talk about putting regeneration at the heart of creating value. McKinsey, what companies can do to restore natural capital. Talking of which, I received information this morning about a presentation at CSI UWA on the 16th of September about restoring natural capital for those interested in that specific area. The World Economic Forum 2024 highlighted the future of sustainable business is about regeneration. And then one of the great think tanks talk about the triple bottom line there of responsibility, resilience, and regeneration. So just looking to those big companies and many others, there's a lot of work going on in that space. Sorry, just got to move forward here. I don't want to spend a lot of time on taking a look at UWA. For those of us that are here, we're aware that there's a lot of work going on and a lot of attention is being given to the notion of sustainability, particularly around the Sustainable Development Goals. But again, the question is, where is the conversation and what's the narrative? Again, the narrative is we're still focused on what it means to be sustainable. Even the consideration of achieving net zero. What's net zero? Net zero is a neutral position. It's somewhere between sustainable and regenerative. It's zero carbon emissions. Yet we've already exceeded, if you like, carbon emission quotas. So now we need to be looking at what do we do to sequester carbon from the atmosphere? How can we draw carbon back down again? What technologies do we have in place for that? And there are organizations whose production processes interface as one organization. They produce carpet tiles. They achieved net zero in 2019, have moved to a regenerative posture since then. Producing the carpet tiles sequesters carbon from the atmosphere. So that's already moving into that net positive state. That's going beyond sustainability to looking at what can be done regeneratively as well. So I put it out there as a question for all of us, operating in academia or elsewhere. What are we doing in our teaching, our research and service, our wider purpose to working towards a more regenerative position? How do we embed or how do we consider regenerativity and what it means in the work that we do? I go back to those 9 planetary boundaries again. So remember, they denote the safe and operating space for humanity to sustain life on Earth. These are those ecological boundaries. And of course, it's not just about climate change. We see a lot of emphasis on climate change, but it's about all of the boundaries. So we can take a look at, for example, land systems. Oil and soil degradation impacts land use, impacts on residential areas, housing, community stability, agricultural productivity, food security, economic activity, employment and income, etc. In other words, much of the social fabric that makes up society. So whether we think about climate change or whether we visit any of those other Earth system boundaries or planetary boundaries, again, of which we've exceeded 7 and 6, depending on which you look at, we don't have to go far to see the social consequences of our activities. Just need to, my mouse keeps dying on me here in advancing my slides. some of you might have heard, I'm sure, of the work of Kate Raworth in terms of donut economics. What Kate is doing is looking at the relationship between the social sphere, if you like, and the ecological sphere. Johan Rockström himself talks about, we have to achieve the SDGs within PBs, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals within planetary boundaries. Obviously, if we were not to think about the planetary boundaries, then activities towards achieving those Sustainable Development Goals may run rampant and take us into those tipping points. So if we look at this particular depiction here in the light green, you can see those social dimensions there. These are those that reflect internationally agreed minimum social standards, and I'm sure I think many of you here from connected with the CSI Centre for Social Impact will recognise those. And so this model here in the work of donut economics and the deal, what's referred to as the deal community, donut economics action laboratories, really emphasise the relationship between those Earth system boundaries, those planetary boundaries, and the social systems. And there's a lot of work going on in that space globally. And all of that and the language that's used is emphasizes what it means to develop a regenerative future. So anybody perhaps starting out and looking at work in that area would certainly be encouraged to take a look at the work of Kate Raworth, and they've got a great set of resources online that are free for access. So when I think about that particular work and the bigger picture around resource application, it's only when we have the necessary resources to respond on perhaps the most vulnerable members of society, the elderly, children, others who are disadvantaged in some respect, can we really start talking about truly working towards what it means to develop a regenerative and inclusive future for all. Remember, it's a future where every individual is flourishing, societies are flourishing, and the planet is flourishing too. So I've talked about planetary health. It's not a new concept, of course. It's inherent in indigenous cultures for centuries, the wisdoms there that connect individual to land, which is really the conversations that we're trying to develop here in this work. The concepts of human health and planetary health are not divorced from one another. They're not separate. They are one and the same thing. And so when we talk about healing the earth, we're also talking in the same breath about healing ourselves. We can't think otherwise if we recognize and accept what living in an interconnected environment actually means. So we have this significant need now for imaginative, integrated solutions. With some of my colleagues, we talk about radical innovation, solutions that build upon the very best of human nature. These are performative, positively performative in that sense, that tap into the deeper values that unite and empower and refocusing priorities of individuals and societies toward healthier futures, a future that in itself is regenerative. So that's the direction, that's the journey that we need to take. I'm aware that there are many questions unanswered in terms of this. That's not surprising, because still, as a society, as a collective of individuals, people that are talking about these issues still somewhat in the minority and at the fringe, and yet we literally have there is no other solution to us than to embrace what it means to live a regenerative life, to embrace regenerative solutions toward a more regenerative future. And I think a significant part of that is changing the conversation that we have, changing the narrative that we use as well. In a presentation I gave in a virtual presentation in New York a few months ago, where we were talking about is there such a concept as regenerative marketing, regenerative consumption? Can we talk about those terms in the same breath? And I raised the issue of, part of the issue there, I fervently believe is the narrative of and the language we use in regard to consumption. So simplistically, we talk about ourselves as consumers. I mean, we are consumers. It's difficult to get away from that. But I think that there's a strong connection there between our behaviors and the roles that we play. So the more we believe that we're consumers, the more the economic system tells us that we're consumers, the likelihood is that we will consume. And that becomes, behavior begets, if you like, the narrative that we're using. And I ask the question, well, what if we were to change that? What if we were to, rather than talk about or think of ourselves as consumers of finite resources, we thought of ourselves as co-creators of planetary health? Would our activities around consumption change? I believe they would, not just our attitudes, but our behaviors as well at the same time. And so, that's the challenge that I've put out for myself. I'm not the only person working in this space. There are many, many other individuals around the globe working in this space. And hopefully we will be joined by hundreds of thousands more, because it takes more than the efforts of one individual or one collective. This is something that, given the interconnected nature of humanity, we all have to be embracing and working towards a more regenerative future. So I'll leave it at that, Lisette, and would welcome questions. I can't guarantee to be able to answer all the questions, but I'm very much myself on that learning journey too. So over to you, Lisette. You're on muted, Lisette.
Thanks for that. Thank you so much for that really thoughtful and at times quite confronting presentation. But in the end, you've shown some pathways forward and how to have a little bit of hope and what some of the solutions might look like, and also left us with some questions to ponder. So opening up the floor to, it looks like there's about 50 people in the room. We definitely recommend, what would be ideal is if you could turn off your microphone or raise your hand or just indicate you have a question. If not, you can put your question in the chat and I might call on you or ask you to say your question if you have a question for David.
So just if I could add, what would be good as well for those chat questions, if we can collect those, and then I can grab a copy of those and possibly respond to them. If I'm not able to respond to them adequately in the presentation, I can try and respond to them outside of the presentation and share those somehow, perhaps in conjunction with the slides, which I'm very happy to put together and to share with the audience as well.
Excellent. Be great. And Dave, do you want to just stop sharing your screen so we can see your face a little better? Okay.
Absolutely. Something like that.
Yeah, perfect. Great. I believe maybe Nikki Harvey, do you want to turn off your mic? Oh, there you are.
Hello. Thanks so much, David. That was really, really interesting. I'm really interested to understand, you said you've just embarked on your new economics studies in this space. So you're probably aware that the Australian government released their Nature Repair Act at the end of last year, and there's that move towards creating a framework around a nature repair economy. And I'm just really interested to know if you have any insights based on your experience and learning so far about what you think are going to be, the opportunities and challenges of trying to establish a nature repair market in Australia, and what do you think some of the key success factors will be if we're going to be able to make it work?
Yeah, absolutely, Nikki. It's a great question, and I think it's indicative as well of the efforts that are being made in different areas, and great to see that that our government is starting to think in those terms as well. I'm slightly hesitant, only slightly hesitant, because the idea of repair suggests restoration, which of course is important, but it's not quite regeneration. So we can restore environments, and then unless they are self-regenerative, then they can still either self-deplete based on human interaction, or they can be depleted as well on the basis of human interaction. And I'm just talking there at the conceptual level. But yes, I'm aware that there's an incredible amount of work going on, not just in Australia within specific areas, specific communities, but also globally in terms of recognizing that we need to really focus on nature repair. Now, having said that, of course, that's only one part of the bigger picture. That's one part of the system. And so repairing nature at the same time as depleting resources, because we're maintaining a business as usual economy which is driven by consumption of finite resources, is going to counteract that. It's going to be counterproductive in that sense. So this is where I think it's really important to develop that much more sort of open systems view and recognize the interconnectedness between those different systems, so that when we're looking at solutions, our solutions are more interconnected and bring together the different dimensions. And then we're starting to look at the actions that are working on both parts. And this is one of the things that we do when we talk about planetary health, is inherently we recognize that interconnectedness. So planetary health is, I'm not sure if there are any medical professionals in the audience, but it's something that's been advanced since about 2015, recognizing not just from a medical intervention perspective, but trying to actually dig down and ascertain what the cause of disease is. And that's quite a different stance for the medical profession to take. And so they're still working that through into the profession. But when we start to ask those questions of what caused, or what is the cause of, XYZ disease, and the comorbidities associated with them, then we start to dig back into other areas. So, for example, the impact of nutrition on human health is quite significant. Yet the productivity, the health of food produce is determined by the health of the soil. Health of the soil is determined by the health of the planet in overall terms. If the soil is degraded by virtue of our agricultural systems, where we spray the living daylights out of everything with toxins, then of course what we put into ourselves is not going to be productive in positive health terms. It's going to be counterproductive. So little wonder that we get sick. So I'm just, sort of presenting a narrative which is much, much wider. But I think, going back to your point, Nikki, which I'm, particularly pleased about, because I actually come out of originally an environmental school and feel very much a part of connected to nature globally, and spend a lot of time in nature, and that is health inducing for me. I think it's really positive to see the government sort of shifting the conversation in that direction, and hopefully the conversation will remain in place and continue to be open for further development.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Any questions? I think people can respond directly here.
Yeah, I think we've just had a question in chat. Dr. Norman Arshed, I don't know if you're around to turn off your mic, or do you want me to read the question? Can't see him.
You can answer the question. If you want, I can read.
Yeah, please read.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So my question is actually that if it's from the consumption side, that if the people are perceiving that the systems are now regenerative and it's healing itself, do you think there will be a threat that people will be less careful to in their habits, that the system is healing itself, why don't we care? So do you think it will become a threat that in the systems that people will not put a value on their effort to reduce carbon?
Gosh, there's a number of issues there. Norman, thank you very much for the question. I wish I was hopeful enough to say that we're likely to arrive at that point in the near future. I think that's we're so far removed from that. Even the concept of sustainability is not embedded within the language of many people. Will the concept of regenerativity induce, I guess, an apprehension, I think is what you're saying, or an attitude within people that it no longer matters because the systems are regenerating themselves? I don't really see that happening. I think there's a number of things that will take place in the interim. First and foremost, I think that what we will hopefully see is that the relevance of consumption is reduced. Remember, I look at consumption here as being a part of a system which is bent on growth as a goal, with the consumption of finite resources determining how much economies grow. And year on, year out, the constant conversation there is how much the economy has either grown by or deteriorated by. And, that is where consumption comes into the picture. So, we've got a lot of work to do yet. We need to refocus our thinking around what a regenerative economy would look like. So if we can shift the emphasis away from growth, then by implication, we reduce the focus on consumption. And so we end up with an economy that, and I know that there's a question going to come out here, well, what would an economy that's not driven by consumption actually look like? We talk in terms of flourishing, we talk in terms of well-being as opposed to gross domestic product. And how do we achieve well-being without consumption? And those are big questions, and I don't have the answer to those questions. That's part, I think, of the bigger conversation that needs to take place. So, coming back to your point, Norman, I guess there's a psychological element here as well, and it may well be that people dip into the notion of the existence of regenerativity as a reason, as a rationalization for them to continue to consume in the way that perhaps they are currently consuming or wanting to consume in the future. So I see that particular posture as an expression of what we might describe as an inhibiting argument, and we need a system that supports the opposite. We need a more enabling posture. And as I speak, and as I'm sure you're hearing the words, you're recognizing the enormity of this issue. And clearly it is. I've used the expression of create a regenerative future for all, and that is it has to be more than simply idealistic language. A regenerative future where all individuals and the planet are flourishing has to be more than simple motherhood expressions, if you like. So Norman, I'm aware that perhaps I haven't fully answered your question. That's I think it's a work in progress there, but I understand the point. I don't if we were to ever arrive at that particular position, I think it may be some way in the future in terms of the way in which we discuss these issues, and that's part of what we need to overcome as well.
Thank you, David. We have questions from Michelle and Peggy and Mariana. We've got 3 minutes left, so if anyone needs to go, please do. But maybe, and also if anyone wants to write the question in the chat, we can get that to David. But meantime, we'll hear from Michelle. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Thanks so much, Dave, for the insights. It was really eye-opening. Just from what you were saying before, it sounds like we really need to redefine like traditional economic concepts. So in your opinion, like whether it's on a global scale or even a national scale in Australia, like who needs to get the ball rolling, in your opinion?
Yes. Where does responsibility start? Good question. It starts with everybody all at the same time, but everybody needs to be, and that includes all of our systems. So our political system needs to recognise and reinforce the what a potential regenerative future could look like and start moving in that direction. At the same time, of course, there needs to be a recognition at the individual micro level too, from consumers. In terms of which is the easier, you know, there's a complexity involved on both sides. I think that business can play a significant driving force for change, and supported by government activity as well at the same time. If I look at it at the individual level, the kind of conversations I have with individuals is very different from the kind of conversations I have collectively with organizations. On an individual level, you know, people tend to express the best version of themselves. In other words, their most positive values. And at least in linguistics, you know, in terms of the conversation, talk about doing the right things. But, you know, when push comes to shove, we experience the opposite from a consumer point of view. And, you know, I could go on talking about this particular issue when it comes to what a regenerative business would look like in a regenerative economic framework that supports a more regenerative industry space. So much to talk about in that sense. And hopefully I'll get a chance to perhaps, you know, focus another presentation at a later point in time on those issues. But I guess the quick answer to that question is responsibility of everybody, Michelle. But I think you know, organisations and the government can really make a significant inroad in driving things forward in that respect.
Great, thanks, David. We've got 3 more questions that have been written on the chat. So unless anyone wants to stay around to chat, we might finish there. Peggy, you were next. Did you want to talk to David, or are you happy to email?
Yeah, I've typed in the questions as well. Thank you, Dave. I was wondering, so if we want to interpret the concept of regenerativity in terms of human health, is it going to be immunity that is likely to describe the ability to regenerate, say, energy, organs, or anything like that? Is it immunity or anything else that's equivalent or on the same page?
Sorry, Peg, I'm not sure I understood the question.
So if we want to, say, explain to a patient of yours about regenerativity, would you say that we are now restoring, recovering, or we are now trying to improve your immunity?
No, I don't think, well, I'm not a medical professional. My colleague, Professor Susan Prescott is, and so she would have a more detailed response for you, Peggy, in that respect. I think it's not necessarily the language that needs to change, but perhaps some of the approaches taken, which are geared more towards a patient-centric position. So putting the patient or enabling the patient to be able to take responsibility as well for their own health, and having systems that actually support that in place. I have done some work in Austria and Germany where we were looking at cardiovascular patients, and we developed an online facility that patients could sign up to, and the goal of the site was to maximise the self-determined responses of patients. And what we were finding is that even patients who had experienced cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular events were returning to detrimental behaviours within the short space of 3 weeks. And interestingly, the reasoning that they gave behind that is that the system itself was so good that they felt that, were they to experience another event, that they would simply have to turn up again, present themselves, and get fixed. So we started looking at ways in which we could develop a more supportive environment outside of the medical profession, because obviously there's a significant cost implication in that respect. So I think it's more about not necessarily changing the language, but putting systems and processes in place that reinforce and build more self-determined responses from patients. And that in itself would be part of what we would look at as being a regenerative type system. But great question there, Peggy.
Thanks.
Okay, the last person with their hand up, Mariana, do you want to quickly ask a question and then we'll wrap up?
Yes, thank you very much, David. Really, my question follows on from what has been asked previously, and really it's focusing around the urgency of the conversations that are needed. And do you think that the SDGs are a good starting point for global action on this, or do they not go far enough to deliver this needed paradigm shift?
Yeah.
Basically, that's...
Yeah, no, really, really good question, Mariana. And unfortunately, we're falling short on achieving the SDGs. I think one of the real advantages to the SDGs is that they have entered the conversation space as a framework that people can understand and identify where the significant areas for action are required. And so, yeah, I think they have played an incredibly important role and will continue to play an important role throughout their journey. They have another 5 years to go. And then obviously there will need to be a replacement, whether they are resilience development goals or regenerative development goals is, that's still a conversation that's taking place. But the underlying conversations that contribute towards the action plan, if you like, and that's what the SDGs are. They are an action plan, they're an action agenda moving forward. They need to change too. And that's where the narrative of regenerativity needs to take over, if you like, from some of the conversation, some of the narrative around sustainability. So at the moment, yeah, an excellent framework. They're easy for most of us to tap into. We do across the university sector, many industries do as well, and I continue to see them as an important part of that movement, that journey forward to a more regenerative position.
Cool. Thank you very much. I know we've gone over, but it was such a significant conversation and such interesting comments in the chat too, which I'll make sure I pass on to you, David, as well.
Thank you for inviting me, Paul, as well, to present to CSI, and I've really enjoyed the presentation and thinking it's always a challenge for me too to expand on the language of regenerativity across all domains of life, because that's where the conversation needs to be held. And look forward to further conversations, and thank all participants as well for their attention and for their great questions.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.